Hi, everyone. Welcome to the N3AS seminar today. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Alex Haber from WashU in St. Louis. Alex obtained his PhD from Institute for Theoretical Physics, Vienna University of Technology in 2018. Since then, he has been a postdoc working at WashU with Mark Alford. His research focuses on properties of dense nuclear matter and quark matter in the cores of neutron stars, including interplay between superfluidity and superconductivity of exotic phases in strong magnetic fields, and most recently, transport properties of neutron stars in conditions relevant for mergers. And today, we are glad to hear his talk on this topic, new developments in this field, and also some future prospects, I guess. For the audience, please mute yourself during the talk. If you have any questions, please indicate in the chat window or use the raise hand button. There will be time for informal discussion afterwards. Okay, so Alex, please go ahead.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Sophia, for the nice introduction and for the invitation. So as Sophia has already said, I'm Alexander Haber. I'm a postdoc at WashU here in St. Louis. And this work I'm going to present has mostly been done in collaboration with Mark Alford here, with Stephen Harris, who is in the audience and now a postdoc at the INT, and our grad student, Suan Zhang, and is based mostly on these papers. So let me say what I want to talk about in the very broadest context. So really the question we want to answer overall is really how can we use transport in neutron star mergers to study the QCD phase diagram? And I'd like to give the answer away right now, and this is what I'm going to try to convince you in the following 20-25 minutes or so. So the answer is we need to build better gravitational wave detectors. We need to observe more neutron star merger. We need to observe the merger phase. But in order to really learn a lot about QCD from these detectors, we also need to improve the microscopic physics that goes into the general relativity simulations of these mergers. And in order to do that, there's a lot of T=0 wisdom. As a community, we've learned a lot about neutron stars in the last decades by now, but in most cases, we've worked at T=0 at vanishing temperature. And mergers are just a little bit hotter, so we have to reevaluate a lot of the wisdom we've learned. So a short outline, I really want to start with an introduction. And I know that some people in the audience are probably more experts on these topics I'm going to talk about at the beginning than I am, but I want to set the stage a little bit and explain a little bit how we observe neutron stars and how we use them to study dense matter, how we measure gravitational waves, or what numerical relativity has to do with it. Then talk about the thermodynamics of neutron star merger, and then discuss a little bit the relevant transport properties. Then I will focus on our results, where we've done a lot of work on bulk viscosity, but the main newest work we've done is about chemical equilibrium in mergers, and this will be the last part of my talk. So most of you probably are familiar with the QCD phase diagram, and as I said, our goal is really to understand this diagram a little bit better and learn the phase structure of QCD. And you see I've drawn various versions here. On the left, you have a very conservative version. So all these diagrams have the chemical potential on the horizontal axis and the temperature on the vertical axis. So you can think of this as density. And you see in this very conservative version, we just mainly distinguish between a confined and a deconfined phase. We can be a little bit bolder and draw a lot of lines that we not really know that well. But the question is, how do we study this diagram? How do we learn whether these lines are really here? And I tried to summarize this a little bit in this diagram. And of course, the investigation of the QCD phase diagram can be done in an experimental way or in a theoretical way. And as we all know, in reality, this is always a mix. We need to support, these two communities need to work together. But the issue maybe is that there's a huge range of thermodynamic parameters involved. So here on this plot, we just have, again, temperature and density. But of course, you could draw another axis and draw this diagram at various different neutron fractions, at magnetical fields. You can have more complex phases involved, and so on and so on, more complex, different hyperons, other things like that. So there's a lot of stuff that can go into this diagram. So how can we study it? At really high densities and temperatures up here, we could use perturbative QCD, but of course, this only works at really high densities and it's not applicable to the matter we directly find on Earth or in neutron stars. At lower densities but higher temperatures, we can work with lattice QCD in this region, which of course is this famous sign problem, so we can only work at smaller densities. Nuclear theory, we live here on Earth, so this is where nuclear theory works. Experimentally, of course, there's a lot we can do. Particle colliders roughly cover this area of the phase diagram. Of course, we have not seen yet this critical endpoint, but collider experiments like RIG, the LHC, or in the future Panda and Nika are trying to work and cover this part of the diagram. But I want to work and focus on this regime on neutron stars. And this is where our conventional small temperature wisdom of the last decades come in, where we studied compact stars, neutron stars for quite some time. And they are really dense, they roughly cover this area, but they are really cold. And neutron star mergers are a little bit more interesting in that sense, because they might cover even higher density range, but they cover for sure a much larger temperature range. So this is why they really give us a new and a unique opportunity to discover or to study parts of the QCD phase diagram. So as I said, these are really important and interesting for us. And the main features that we can not only observe them by electromagnetic radiation, but also using gravitational waves. So it's a really new way. And merger tests dense matter at densities several times saturation density and tens of MeV of temperature. But using these observations to infer properties of dense matter is quite challenging. But since it's a quite unique opportunity, I think this is an interesting problem that we should really tackle. So we all have seen these plots several times. So we have seen gravitational waves. We've seen the binary neutron star in spiral with the current LIGO detectors. You see a picture of LIGO, Livingston, and Hanford here. But the problem is these signals can be very noisy. So it's not enough to just look at the signal. This will not help us to learn a lot about QCD. So we need to simulate, using numerical relativity, we need to simulate the waveform to extract as much information as we can, or even observe some of these signals. And these simulations, of course, then provide us with thermodynamic input and allow us to extract microscopic properties of matter, and that's what I am after. So I'm not an expert on merger simulations, so this is just a rough overview of what merger simulations take into account. So in the core of it, there are a mix of numerical general relativity and hydrodynamics. And it takes some things into account. Of course, general relativity, this is really the underlying basis of these simulations. You have to evolve space-time or the metrics throughout the merger. You need hydrodynamics. You need some microscopic input. The equation of state provides that. So the equation of state is the pressure as a function of the energy density, is what describes the behavior and the composition of matter. But often in these simulations, they use simple model equations, not based on microscopic physics. And then magnetic fields play a role, so some electrodynamics is included, and neutrino transport is also quite important. And I will talk a little bit about neutrinos later on. So to summarize the last slide, basically simulations can be seen as a mix of numerical GR and relativistic hydrodynamic. And please don't get me wrong, I really don't mean that these simulations are somehow too simple. So they're really technically hard to do and quite sophisticated, but still necessarily neglect a lot of physics. So in other words, we cannot just give somebody who does these simulations the entire standard model Lagrangian and say, please implement everything. This is physics, we need all of that. So that's not possible. So we need some improvements for these simulations, especially if we want to learn as much as possible from the post-merger phase. But the question is, where do we start? And in order to answer this question, we have to look a little bit into the environment of a neutron star merger. And that's what I'm trying to do with these plots here that are taken from this paper. So if you focus on the lower plot here for the beginning, you see that this is as a function of time. This is not temperature. Time in milliseconds, t equals 0 corresponds to when the two stars first touch. And you see this time range is roughly 20 milliseconds. And on this axis, you see the density plotted normalized to the saturation density up to 4 or 5 times saturation. And every colored line corresponds to a different fluid element. And you see these quite strong density fluctuations here with a roughly of a 1 kilohertz frequency, especially in the first 5 milliseconds, but there are oscillations going on for longer with quite large amplitude. And in the upper panel, you see a very similar plot, just with temperatures. You also see a lot of variation in temperature. So what does this tell us is immediately if you see like these spatial and temporal variations in these quantities, like temperature, you think about thermal conductivity. This must play a role here. Or if you see this variation in fluid velocity, you think about shear viscosity. Or if you see these density fluctuations, you might think, oh, bulk viscosity might play an important role here. So how do we determine which of these transport processes really play an important role? So we came up with some kind of criterion. We had to come up with some kind of criterion, and you can convert these dissipative processes or these transport properties into some sort of time scale. And this time scale has to be on this 20 millisecond scale. So if they take, like if thermal conductivity is important on a time scale of years or minutes, then it's not going to play a role in this post-merger phase. So the question we really have to ask is, which processes operate on a merger time scale?
Alex?
Yeah?
There is a question from Pedro asking, do each of these lines correspond to simulations run with different codes, or are they all run with the same code?
So if I remember correctly, this is all the same code, but corresponds to different places in the merger. So you have different fluid elements, and this is a fluid element tracer that follows the density or the temperature in this fluid element.
I think more importantly, are these hydrodynamical calculations performed with viscous hydrodynamics?
I don't think there's a lot of viscosity included besides numerical viscosity.
Okay, so the oscillations we see may not be due to viscous processes at all, except for numerical viscosity.
Yeah, no, what I want to say is there is a lot of density oscillations, and this means you should probably take some sort of bulk viscosity into account. Okay. So it's more a motivation of why we're looking at bulk viscosity in these kind of processes. Okay. So yeah, the next slide. So now I said before, the premise really is the important dissipation mechanism are those ones whose equilibration time is sub 20 milliseconds. And Mark and some collaborators in 2018 have written this really nice PRL where they estimated some of these transport properties. And I'm just going to pick out thermal transport here. And this is in a neutrino trapped regime, so temperatures above 510 MeV. So neutrinos are trapped to build up a Fermi sea, they have a chemical potential and so on. And you see most of these quantities are probably of the order of 1, and you see the prefactor here is like, it's on the second scale, and we need milliseconds. So the question is, can this get shorter? And the most important ingredient here is this typical length scale of a temperature gradient. And if these are like not on the kilometer scale, but on the 0.1 kilometer scale, this gets squared, so right in the millisecond regime. But it's a little bit high. You can come to a very similar conclusion for shear viscosity, but if you do the same with bulk viscosity, you get a lower coefficient here. So you might think bulk viscosity seems to be kind of promising on this level of basic calculation. And the question is it now large enough for some significant damping of oscillations in this millisecond time range? And with that, I want to start a short PR portion of this talk where I advertise a couple of papers that we have written. So this is mostly work done by Stephen Harris. So if you have questions, it's probably better to ask him if you want to know more about nuclear bulk viscosity. So we have to distinguish between the neutrino transparent regime, temperatures sub 5 MeV, and then neutrino trapped regime, temperatures above 10 MeV. In between, it's a little bit murky. So for nuclear bulk viscosity, you see the bulk viscosity plotted here on the left as a function of temperature. Bulk viscosity, you see it has quite a resonant peak. This is for a given equation of state and a given frequency, and some different densities here. And more importantly, I think is this plot here on the right, which converts this bulk viscosity into a dissipation time. And you see this contour, this is a contour plot, the contour temperature and baryon density. And you see at these rather low densities, at temperatures around 3 MeV or so, you see that they're quite short dissipation times. So the answer is for nuclear bulk viscosity. Nuclear bulk viscosity might play an important role in the sub 5 MeV regime. If you do the same calculation in the neutrino trapped regime, which has been done by collaborators Armin Sitrakian, Aras Harutian, and Mark, then you find that the rates are rather fast. So you're more on this side of this resonant peak, and the bulk viscosity gets too low, and we don't get short dissipation times. I personally have more worked on hyperonic bulk viscosity. There we've looked mainly at non-leptonic processes. If you want to know more about that, you can find this here in this paper. And what we find is that you only get millisecond damping times at really low temperatures. So the left plot shows again bulk viscosity. This time is a function of density, and I've shown various different temperatures. And you see that the highest bulk viscosity you get at quite low temperatures in the keV range. So if you focus on the right plot here, that's the same plot as before, density, temperature, this contour plot. What you see is that the maximum is at 3 keV, not MeV. This is a different scale here. So probably, unless the merger is unexpectedly cold, you can neglect hyperon bulk viscosity in a neutron star merger. Okay, with that, I'm already done with the PR portion, and I want to focus the second part of my talk on our newest results and our most recent paper, where we talk about beta equilibrium. So what is beta equilibrium? What is its chemical equilibrium? So what we mean by that is the composition of matter in our system. Let's think of it like the proton fraction stays constant over time. It doesn't change anymore. And of course, the only thing that can change a proton fraction, neutron fractions, any kind of particle fractions is the weak interaction. The weak interactions enable us to turn neutrons into protons and so on. So we can look at these kind of decays, and there are roughly two classes. We can think of neutron decay, where we have a neutron in the incoming channel, and it will decay into a proton and an electron. And then we can add various spectators. We have to balance the lepton number with neutrinos or antineutrinos on one or the other side, but this is the basic structure of neutron decay. And of course, in some sense, the opposite, the basic structure of electron capture. You have a proton capturing an electron. So on the other side of the reaction, you get a neutron. I said before, above 10 MeV neutrinos are trapped. So in this talk, I will only assume that neutrinos are free streaming, so we don't have any neutrino chemical potential. But the important thing is, if we want to reach beta equilibrium, these kind of reactions have to balance these kind of reactions. So on average, the same amount of neutrons are decaying as protons are catching electrons again and turn back into neutrons. So then the neutron fraction will stay constant. So if these rates balance and are the exact inverse to each other, that's what we call detailed balance. So this means these dots are really fill out the same, so that these rates become each inverse. This is what we call cold beta equilibrium, and this is really correct at vanishing temperatures. And then we immediately see that the neutron chemical potential is equal to the proton chemical potential and the electron chemical potential. And this is really like common wisdom at cold temperatures. You will always use that in calculations. Beta equilibrated matter, this is how the chemical potentials are related. And the question we now ask is this still valid at moderate but finite temperatures, or is there some sort of correction that we have to take into account? So when we look at these processes in more detail and fill out the dots for the so to say leading and next to leading order, so this is what we call the Urca processes. So Urca processes are weak semi-leptonic decays, and the important thing is these are happening in an environment of dense matter. So you might think of neutron decay in a lab, a free neutron decaying, but the situation is a little bit different here because we have a Fermi sea of neutrons, a Fermi sea of protons and electrons. So I will explain this maybe a little bit better with this equation. This is the only equation I have in my slides. So what we call direct Urca is just basically neutron decay in a medium. So you have a neutron decaying to a proton, electron, and an antineutrino, such that lepton number is balanced and or conserved. And the inverse electron capture, proton plus electron goes to neutron plus neutrino. And inverse is a little bit a dangerous word here because it's not exactly the inverse, right? I'm already saying this here. So you see the neutrinos, since we don't build up a Fermi sea of neutrinos, we don't have neutrinos available in the incoming channel. We have these too low temperatures. The neutrinos are just escaping the mergers. So they can only appear on the right-hand side of our reactions. How do we compute these rates? So we see we have 4 particles in the game. Each of them has a 3 momentum, so it's a 12-dimensional phase space integral. There's a matrix element that describes this transition. And this is the important distinction. We need to, so this is for neutron decay, direct Erka neutron decay. So we need to find a neutron. So there's a Fermi-Dirac distribution that gives us the probability of finding a neutron with a given momentum. And since we want to decay into a proton and an electron, Pauli exclusion principle applies. So we have to find an electron hole. So this is the Fermi-Dirac dispersion distribution, for the electrons, and this for the protons. So we need to find an electron hole and a proton hole. If we compute electron capture, these roles, of course, switch. And on top of that, of course, we have to conserve energy and momentum. So this is just baked into this Dirac delta here. So in general, if we have this kind of decays, if it's possible, these decays will be always dominated by particles directly on their Fermi surface. And the question we have to ask is momentum conservation on the Fermi surface fulfilled? So if we want to have, so we have a Fermi momentum of neutrons, protons, and electrons. And if we want to have any chance of momentum conservation, we need the neutron momentum to be rather small compared to the proton and the electron, or smaller than the sum. So I've drawn this diagram here. And you see, if the neutron momentum would be larger than the sum of those, then even if they're co-aligned, you cannot make up this, you cannot fulfill this triangle equation. So if momentum conservation on the Fermi surface is not possible, the rate will be heavily suppressed. We can help out a little bit and cheat, so to say, by helping momentum conservation by adding a spectator nucleon. So this is what we call modified Erka. You see, it's the same structure, neutron decay, electron capture, and we just add a neutron here, or a nucleon here and here, here and here, and then electron capture. And it's kinematically, it will work out then. So this is what we call the direct Erka threshold. So what do I mean? The question is this fulfilled? And when it's fulfilled, we call this the direct Erka threshold. So when the neutron momentum is exactly the proton Fermi momentum and the electron Fermi momentum, this is what we call the direct Erka threshold. And you see this is really a property of the equation of state. And a direct Erka threshold requires quite a high proton fraction. So we need a smaller neutron Fermi momentum. And in general, for nearly all equations of state, the proton fraction will go up with density. So there's a lower density threshold. Below this threshold, direct Erka is not allowed, above it is allowed. So this is what I'm plotting in this diagram as a function of density again. And this is this difference between the left-hand side and the right-hand side. So this direct Erka momentum surplus. And you see I'm comparing 2 different equations of state here, IUF and SFHO. And you see that IUF is monotonically rising at a density of roughly 4.1 saturation. It crosses 0 here, so above this line, direct Erka can happen kinematically on the Fermi surface, whereas for SFHO, it never works out. Direct Erka is always kinematically forbidden. So both these models are relativistic mean field models. And I have a short slide here that I think I can neglect or ignore. This is more if you work with relativistic mean field models, you might know that, but in relativistic mean field models, we have an effective in medium mass and it drops really fast. So what we found is that if you work with relativistic mean field models, you have to assume that nucleons are relativistic, otherwise you get really wrong results. But this is just a detail of the calculation. Let me come to our results here. And the question is now is, why I'm not drawing, I don't want that. Okay. So here I'm plotting the rates now in the traditional chemical beta equilibrium. So you see the neutron chemical potential equals the proton and the electron chemical potential. This is for a temperature of 3 MeV. And you see the neutrino, the rates here, the neutron decay and electron capture rates as a function of density. And the two colors are the same colors as here, so they correspond to two different equations of state. So if we focus on this line first, this is neutron decay in the IUF equation of state. And you see this threshold is marked with a vertical line here, and you see really clearly this jump around the threshold, where the neutron decay is kinematically forbidden, but because there's finite temperature, it's forbidden only on the Fermi surface, but you have finite temperature, so there's some sort of decay going on. And this is also direct Doppler plus modified Doppler. So this is already summed up. So modified Doppler can, of course, always happen. You see this jump here. And here you see an electron capture, also the orange line. We need to compare the orange lines with each other for IUF. And you see clearly in chemical equilibrium, I said these rates are supposed to be the same. They're supposed to balance each other. But you can clearly see, especially around the direct Doppler threshold, that's not the case at all. But this is a log plot, so it's really a difference of 2 orders of magnitude here. And it's also quite large here. So cold beta equilibrium is clearly violated. And the reason I already gave that away, electron capture and neutron decay are not inverse processes to each other. So the neutrino switches side, it's always in the outgoing channel. How can we fix that? Well, we have to add a correction term here. So the neutron chemical potential is the proton plus electron plus a correction that we call mu delta. And we compute mu delta such that now the neutron decay rate, sum of direct and modified Doppler, now really balances the electron capture rates. And this has first been done by Stephen and Mark in this paper in 2018, and we are proving upon it. This is the newest paper, which is on the archive. And these are for 2 different equations of state. Again, we can just focus on the left and just look at IUF. You see as a function of density for the 3 different temperatures. You clearly see that the mu delta is quite large. So you see it's around 15 to 20 MeV and shows like a bump-like behavior around the direct Doppler threshold. So you see it's not just mu p plus mu e. You need this correction term. It depends on temperature and on density. And we computed such that these rates now balance. And since I claim that, I also wanted to prove that. So in this plot here, as a function of density, you see again the rates. This is now the sum of direct and modified Doppler, again with this corrected, calculated mu delta. And you see the yellow line, this is electron capture, the blue line is neutron decay, and you see these 2 lines really match. So we've done this correctly. And the last plot I want to show is here on the right. This is once again the rates as a function of density, and we split it up, neutron decay and electron capture again, and the direct Doppler and the modified Doppler contribution. I think what's interesting is most people assume that if I'm below the direct Doppler threshold, this is just IUF, so you have a direct Doppler threshold here. If I'm below this threshold, I can just forget about direct Doppler and just can only focus on modified Doppler. And if we look at these lines, that's not really the case. So for neutron decay, that works out fine. You see neutron decay are the solid lines. So the solid line below the threshold, direct Doppler neutron decay is really small and then dominates. And modified Doppler neutron decay is small above the threshold, but then dominates here. But if we compare the dashed lines, we see that direct Doppler is here, up here. So it's it's like nearly an order of magnitude larger than the dashed line we have to compare it to, the golden line with its modified Doppler electron capture. So we see for electron capture, direct Doppler already at a rather small temperature, right? This is just 3 MeV. We can reach way higher temperatures in a neutron star merger. We see that direct Doppler can dominate even at low temperatures. Okay, this is already my last slide. I want to just summarize. I hope that I was able to convince you that we need to improve the microscopic physics that goes into these simulations, and that bulk viscosity might play an important role in neutron star merger. And then in the second part of my talk, I showed you that traditional beta equilibrium is violated for temperatures in the few MeV, in the few MeV range, that mu delta reaches up to 15 or even 20 MeV. And my last conclusion was that direct Doppler, especially for electron capture, can dominate over modified Doppler even below a threshold. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to take a couple of questions.
Thank you, Alex, for this very nice overview. So now it's question time. Please raise your hand. And yeah, so I see Zidu, please unmute yourself and ask a question.
Oh, okay. So hello, Alex. Okay, so I just have some very naive questions. So I'm just wondering, what if, I mean, if your nuclear matter is polluted by some quarks, for example, if it's a hybrid matter of both some protons, nucleons, but with some quarks, then what kind of the beta equilibrium should be obeyed for a hybrid matter?
So you mean really a mixed phase, not a quark core and a separated nucleonic phase, but really a
mixing phase of quarks and nuclear matter. Then what kind of the beta equilibrium should be obeyed there?
That's a good question. Of course, if you have quark matter, you can have neutrino lepton-free decays, right? So maybe that helps you. But I think it will still, you have to add up all the rates that turn neutrons into protons and up quarks into down quarks. I think it will be the same equilibrium as I've presented here, because you still have the same issue that some reactions have neutrinos in the outgoing channel and not in the ingoing channel. So detailed balance will also not be fulfilled.
I'm not sure. I mean, if I understand correctly, I mean, should I have somehow like two separate beta equilibrium? I mean, one beta equilibrium for those chemical potentials between protons, neutrons, and electrons, and another chemical equilibrium between the up quark, down quark, and the strange quark, or somehow, I mean.
Never thought about this mixed phase. I think the quark chemical potentials can equilibrate without any leptons, right?
Okay.
But then you create, because you can create strange, you can go via the strange quark, right? You can create strangeness and then you can balance the electrical charges. So there, the quarks are probably equilibrated.
I think you can relate all the quark chemical potentials to the neutron and proton chemical potentials if there is chemical equilibrium. No problem.
I see. Okay. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the comments. And also I have another question. Okay, I mean, let's just imagine that probably in the future we have some observations relating to these bulk viscosities. For example, like the damping of neutron star oscillations or damping of these mergers. But then, I mean, how can you know, I mean, if we see this kind of if we observe this kind of the damping effect, how can you know how much of this damping is contributed by your bulk viscosity and how much is contributed by the shear of viscosity? So actually my question is that, do you think, are there any kind of the observations that can distinguish the contributions from all these kind of different viscosities?
I think the only way to do that is really implement these various viscosities into merger simulations and see what the waveform comes out and then compare it to. So I don't think there's really such a strong difference in signal that I can do just a dense matter calculation and give you a clear answer to that. I think without incorporating this into merger simulations, I don't think you can distinguish that.
I see. So probably maybe the only way, I mean, to distinguish the contributions from these viscosities are from simulations and the theories.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks. That's all my questions. Thanks.
Mia, please go ahead.
Hi. So I was just, how should we be thinking about this mu delta? Like, is it a chemical potential that's actually bound up somewhere in the system, or is it just a correction term?
That's a good question. So I don't think you can think of it as a chemical potential, like in the sense that it's coupled to a conserved current, because the issue is we neglect neutrinos here because we use a finite volume argument, right? We say, why do we neglect neutrinos? Because the merger region is smaller compared to the mean free path of neutrinos. So because we do that, the neutron decay and electron capture rates don't balance each other at traditional chemical equilibrium. So in that sense, I would say mu delta just tells you how is the neutron chemical potential related to the proton and the electron chemical potential. It's not just a sum, you have to correct it. Is this, what's your question? Is this your question?
I think so.
Okay.
I think
Isn't it related to the out of whack parameter that supernova people are familiar with? Namely, that chemical equilibrium is not completely attained?
This, I don't know. Is there anybody who's working on that who can answer that?
It seems to be the case.
I don't know about the supernova parameter, but it like mu delta, if the weak interaction didn't happen, then mu delta would be an honest to God chemical potential. It would be the isospin chemical potential.
That's right. But I mean, they are working because we are calculating weak decay rates, right? So it's a little bit.
Right. Yeah. So for us in this neutrino transparent, not in statistical equilibrium type arena, then it does not seem to be an actual chemical potential because it's not conserved.
Yeah. But if you turn off weak interactions, then you have higher symmetry. Then you can have another chemical potential, and this would really correspond to an isospin chemical potential, maybe with a different sign. Yeah.
Sanjay, you are the next.
Okay, so I'm wondering, you study two different limits. You study the limit when neutrinos are trapped and you have a finite density of neutrinos in every volume element. And then you take this other limit in which you assume that there are no neutrinos in your volume element. I'm guessing that reality is going to be somewhere in between, because every volume element is being exposed to neutrino radiation from, even in the semi-transparent region or the transparent region. If I just take a chunk of matter in the middle of the neutron star, there are fluxes of neutrinos going through that volume element from all of the other regions. Okay, to give you an example, think of a low temperature region in the neutron star merger. But not far from the low temperature region, maybe a kilometer deeper, there's a 30 MeV region, which is just radiating neutrinos like mad. Those neutrinos will impinge on this small volume element where you're computing weak interaction rates. And if you assume that the neutrino distribution function there is 0 because it's transparent, that would be an error. So in reality, I think what's happening is there's going to be a flux of neutrinos which are not in thermal equilibrium with the local sample. And it might be a good idea for you to study how that flux of neutrinos will alter this out of whackness of beta equilibrium.
I think the one comment that you added is really important, that these neutrinos are not within this fluid element, are not in thermal or chemical equilibrium with the system of the fluid element, right? They are created externally, they're just flying in. So I cannot assign them a chemical potential at a temperature that corresponds to the temperature of the fluid element I'm studying, right?
Yeah, but they're influencing the equilibrium between neutrons and protons. So what they're doing is they're trying to set up the neutron to proton balance there. And so your out of whackness parameter, mu delta, whatever, is going to be sensitive to that flux of neutrinos.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, of course,
what I'd like to know is what is, if you have you looked at it? How big of a flux do you need to have an effect on the mu delta?
No, the two cases we studied was really neutrino completely trapped. They equilibrate within the fluid element. They have the same temperature as the neutrons, the protons, and so on. And the case where no neutrinos, no Fermi-Dirac for them, nothing. So these are the two extreme cases we studied. I mean, there's even an intermediate temperature, right, where you can argue that the mean free path is probably a few hundreds of meters or so, and then you're also in an in-between region, even locally, without taking other neighboring fluid elements into account. So that's why we have like 5 MeV, below 5 and above 10. So in between, it's also probably more difficult.
Okay. All right, thank you.
The next question is from Dake, please.
Oh, hi. So I just have a, I want to confirm. So you mentioned that there haven't been any simulations that sort of consistently including the both bulk and shear viscosity in it. Is that correct?
As far as I know, no. I know groups are working on it and taking parts of it into account. But also, I mean, also the question is, how do you do that, right? They depend on temperature and density, and you have to do that quite locally. So I don't think there's any simulation that takes all of it into account. No.
Well,
Okay.
Helia and people do it. In fact, they have developed viscous hydro to a very sophisticated level. I think we need to learn from them how they do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I'm not working on these simulations or so. We just try to nudge people in the right direction, or tell them what we think is the most important contribution that they should look at first. Maybe that's what we try to do.
And you think it's the bulk viscosity?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
Susan, you are the next, please.
Oh, yes, thank you. I guess I wanted to revisit the earlier question regarding the nature of the mu delta parameter. In particular, it strikes me when you talk about its large size and the trends it might have in a finite temperature environment, I'm mindful that it seems to me the actual value of that quantity might be quite sensitive to small changes in the environment. So you mentioned the possibility of looking at strange matter as well that could be in a hadronic phase. So I might have a small amount of kaons or hyperons, I guess. And it seems to me that could modify the balance of the direct Urquhart process, or even in the medium. And I wondered if you had any perspective on that, because it seems to me that the Fermi quenching factors are completely different, or really, a little hyperon could go a long way in this regard. And I was wondering if you might have any perspective on that.
So if you add hyperons, right, you're gonna equilibrate a different chemical potential, because you have strangeness now as a different conserved quantity in the game.
I'm just remarking, even trivially, that you write down an expression for beta. So the mu delta itself, in this context of chemical equilibrium, it essentially assumes there's no strangeness. But perhaps you could have strangeness, in which case this relationship would actually be broken. And so the question is, I guess I'm just wondering how to segue from this particular relationship, which you study in a system where there's no strangeness at all, and recognizing in the physical context there could be strangeness. So what kind of outcomes would there be? Would it mean that you would possibly have a smaller mu delta that you would have, or that the whole way the discussion is framed isn't quite right? I guess that I'm trying to understand the context in which to put your result.
Yeah, so maybe it's better to look at this plot. And I think what the point we're trying to make really is that if you assume that this is chemical equilibrium without strangeness, then what people often do, they just calculate electron capture and give it a factor of 2 because these rates are really the same, right? So if you calculate like the total amount of neutrinos that are emitted, you calculate the neutrinos coming from this reaction, you multiply it by 2, you're done. But that's not really right, because this is off by 2 orders of magnitude here. So 15 MeV maybe is not, if you compare to the other chemical potentials, which are around 100, between 100, 200 for the electron chemical potential and several hundreds for the proton and the neutron, like a correction of 15 MeV might not sound that big. And of course, it will get corrected if you include hyperons or strangeness or other factors. But even this small deviation, what you think is equilibrium, is quite far off. And I think in this context, it's quite important, even if it changed a little bit when you include strangeness.
Okay. Oh, okay, well, thank you.
Kenji, you are the next.
Okay. Yeah. Hi, Alexander. I have a question about the next slide. You mentioned this chemical equilibrium. Is the chemical potential of nucleons already include the lowest order correction in the temperature inside the formula, or you are including all the temperature dependence into the mu delta?
Oh, all the temperature depends. So we calculate the rate really not in a Fermi surface approximation. So we're really performing these 12-dimensional phase-space integrals. So the Fermi-Dirac distributions are completely temperature dependent, and we take all of this into account. So there's temperature-wise, there's no approximation. We're not in a low temperature approximation for that. Only for modified Orca. For modified Orca, we need to do a small temperature approximation.
Okay. So is this also necessary for the produce the bulk viscosity calculation? So you can also can't use the Fermi-Dirac approximation anymore, right?
Yes. So in the hyperon case and in the nuclear case, I know, yeah, Stephen has also done the full phase-space integral. Yes.
So I have another question about the viscosity produced neutrino and the ERCA produced neutrino. Are there any difference between them when you observe the neutrinos?
Sorry, can you say the question again?
So in neutrino transparent case you talk about, so there should be neutrino production, right? And also in the direct ERCA process, there should also be neutrino production. So are there any chance those could be different? And you can tell which viscous.
Well, they are different in the sense if in a neutrino trapped regime, right, I have to then first of all, I can have neutrinos on the left-hand side here, but then I need to find a hole where I can scatter into. If I want to create a neutrino, I need to find a space that's not polyblocked yet, right? So yeah, the calculation is quite different. And the neutrino will then equilibrate within this fluid element. So it will have the temperature of the system. So we have just we would have one temperature in the entire fluid element. All these Fermi-Diracs will depend on one temperature and will also apply to the neutrino. So they would have a thermal distribution instead of just being created at low energies. So I think the thermal distribution of the neutrinos would be quite different.
Okay. I think if the neutrinos are trapped, they would have their own chemical potentials as well.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Please unmute yourself if you have additional questions for Alex. I do not see more hands up now. Okay, so let's thank Alex for this excellent talk, and thank you everyone for the questions.
Thanks for having me.
Great. See you next week.
See you.
Thank you. Bye.